this leads into the next big company-wide crossover event in 2005, Infinite Crisis. 20 years after Crisis on Infinite Earths, which of course was on the 50th anniversary of the first issue of More Fun Comics. So, Infinite Crisis. At the end of Crisis on Infinite Earths, if you will recall, all those gazillion parallel Earths got merged into one, which basically was Earth 1 as the template, but everything got folded together and changed. When that happened, however, there were 4 characters from outside Earth 1 who survived, who still remembered the events of that crisis and who still remembered the multiverse. And those were Superman and Lois Lane of Earth 2, and there was Superboy from yet another parallel Earth, and Alexander Luthor, son of Lex Luthor from Earth 3, where all the superheroes were villains, and where the only hero was Luthor. So they survived by being folded into a pocket universe. My, those pocket universes sound handy, don't they? Anyway, they had been in this pocket universe watching the events that unfolded on what was now the only reality, the only Earth, watching it from afar for those, 20 years in real time. So that's part of what sets this up. What else sets it up is that Batman, after finding out he had been mind-wiped by his friends, builds a computer system designed to monitor them all at all times to warn him if any of them are in danger of becoming a threat. And, as will happen, this supercomputer he built gets out of hand and decides that all superheroes and supervillains, all superpowered metahumans, are all threats, so they all need to be killed. So it sets about with this army of robots and various other things to try to kill all the metahumans. So that kind of backfired. So that's going on, and at the same time that's going on, the Superboy from Earth Prime originally pounds into the walls of this pocket universe, and he and old Superman, and they escape and set about this plan. Turns out Alexander Luthor's not such a good guy after all, but they set about this plan to bring back Earth 2. So what had happened is that the final 5 alternate reality Earths back in 1986 had been squished together into one Earth. And so now the plan is to unsquish them, that is, from old Superman. That's because Lois Lane, his wife, is dying of old age. And he wants to take things back to how they were. And this is an interesting part. Superman from Earth 2, which would have been the Golden Age Superman, is just disgusted by all the things going on among the superheroes, no doubt identity crisis being foremost among them, and comes to the conclusion they saved the wrong Earth, and these people don't deserve it. They're just a bunch of dark and gritty a-holes. So this effort is made to try to undo the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths, and it doesn't work. And Earth, as people know it, at circa 2006, is saved. But this was immediately followed up by this plot device where, as soon as that miniseries is over, all the different titles put out by DC the next month, they're all set 1 year later. And a lot of stuff has changed, and the reader doesn't know how it changed, including the fact Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman have been missing for months. No one knows where they are. So that's going on, and so the stories pick up from there. But meanwhile, there is this other miniseries, a weekly miniseries called 52. that starts off counting down. Or actually, I guess it's counting up. Counting up from the end of Infinite Crisis, each week telling what happened in the DC universe that week, so that at the end of the year you understand how they got to the 1 year later that by this time had already been going on for a year. And then as soon as the countdown to year one, 1 year later, which finally ends 1 year later, as soon as that happens, then the weekly deal continues. It just shifts over to countdown to Final Crisis, and it starts at week 51 and then goes down. So at the end, at the end of the 1 year leading up to 1 year later, which was at the beginning of that year and is now 2 years later, at the end of that you start counting down for a year until the next crisis, essentially. Okay, so next crisis comes out, starts in 2008. Multi-part thing ends in 2009. This one written by Grant Morrison, and in this one, the big bad guy is DC's biggest bad guy, Darkseid, created by Jack Kirby, all the way back there in the early 70s, the enemy of the new gods that he created. Darkseid is essentially trying to take over the universe, and he is on Earth, and he is controlling the minds. It's kind of like a zombie thing, right? He's like taking people over and turning them over to his zombie slaves, including Wonder Woman and Green Arrow and many other of the heroes. And there's this big fight, of course, and it's all messing with reality to remake reality in his own image. It had been revealed over the course of 52 that the messing around with reality that Alexander Luthor and Superman 2 had done had in fact kind of started unraveling the changes from Crisis on Infinite Earths, so that the multiverse was coming back. It was all kind of going back to how it had been. And then in this series, the big climax is that Superman travels through the multiverse, which is now back in place, and recruits all the Supermans from all of these different Earths, which are all the ones that we know from before, plus a bunch of new ones that they just made up and threw in there. And so when all this is said and done, then the multiverse is back, and now there is again an Earth 1 and an Earth 2. What does all this mean? I don't know. It means that everything changed, and then it changed back, and then it changed, and then it changed back to what it had been before it changed, and then it changed back to what it had been before it changed back to what it had been before it changed. And it's very confusing. If it seems like I'm having a difficult time explaining the plot and the reasoning, so far as the storytelling reasoning behind these various events, it's because I don't really completely understand them myself, and I've read them, some of them more than once. It's very, very convoluted. But stop and think about this. Identity Crisis started in 2004, which led directly into which led directly into Infinite Crisis, which led into 52, which then started counting back down again to count down to Infinite Crisis, which led into Infinite Crisis. So it was all one big crisis. In essence, meaning that DC was in the middle of one big giant company crossover event for 5 solid years. Well, that's where they were by the end of that decade. Something I forgot to mention, by the way, just now when discussing Final Crisis, is that one of the one of the repercussions of that one is that Barry Allen, who was the Silver Age Flash starting in 1956, who was killed off in 1986 in Crisis on Infinite Earths, now is not dead. He's reintroduced. Turns out he's been lost in the vortex of time or something like that. So a couple of years after that, you've got Flashpoint, which is a big crossover that centers on Barry Allen, who wakes up one day and realizes that the Earth he is on is not the Earth he went to sleep in, and everything is changed. And trying to figure that out, that leads into the New 52, in which everything at the conclusion of Flashpoint, everything has been retconned and reset again. And now, not only is there a multiverse, we saw that after Final Crisis, but it has now been set with a limit. There are 52 universes, 52 different Earths. And so to reinforce this idea, DC, quote-unquote, cancels all of their titles at the end of one month and restarts them starting back at number 1 the next month. Now, some titles had been set and reset more than once already, but Action Comics and Detective Comics, the numbering had been the same. It was continually getting bigger and bigger ever since the 1930s. And then one day it's Action Comics number 1 again. So, a lot of changes now in this new timeline, including the fact that, Superman's adopted parents, who were dead on Earth 1, but then never had died and were still alive after a Crisis. Now they're dead again, been dead the whole time. And Clark Kent had married Lois Lane, I think in the 90s, and now that never happened. Then in 2015, there was another big crossover event, Convergence, in which you've got basically, I guess, all these different Earths, the heroes and villains having a big slugfest. Somehow one of the good guys winds up, at least briefly, being the main bad guy from the Warlord Sword and Sorcery book, and then the characters from Watchmen are now part of this multiverse, although doesn't seem like there were major permanent, well, what does permanent even mean, changes at the end of this one until the following year in 2016 when Rebirth started, which reset everything all over again another time. Now, with the New 52, the reset had been, one of the things is that instead of having been around for 10 years, all the superheroes like Superman and Batman had only been around for 5 years, and they weren't trusted or liked by the American public. That's a big change. Anyway, everything changes again. Now, all the different versions of Superman are once more just one Superman. And I just, this is difficult. Now, in 2019, Crisis was adapted on television with a crossover between all of the CW DC superhero series, which there are several, and I can't even begin trying to explain that one. It probably would be easier to explain than DC continuity in the 21st century, but my brain hurts. Now, I have put up this list just in case you think it might help you to keep all this straight, but it won't. And don't worry, you don't need to keep it all straight. For one thing, you don't need to keep it straight for this class, because I'm not going to ask you to explain it, because I can't explain it. And for another thing, you don't need to keep it straight for future reference for when you read the comic books, if you do, because, by next week it'll all be changed. I teach this class every 2 years, and this is the third time I've taught it. When I teach it again, God knows what this section might look like then. Well, for years after, well, even before, for decades, Marvel had seemed to be at least the more stable fictional universe, right? Even back during the days of Earth 1, Earth 2, and all that stuff at DC, at least at Marvel, you knew, okay, this is the Earth. And then this is the storyline, this is the timeline, these are the events that happened. Then when Crisis came, 1985-86, Marvel also seemed like the safer bet if you were wanting consistent storytelling that you knew you could willingly suspend your disbelief with the agreement that next week reality is going to be the same as it was, right? That's no longer true. There's kind of a slide into the same kind of thing that's going on at DC over at Marvel in the 21st century. Now, Marvel does have its own version of an alternate reality Earth with its alternate reality heroes, actually since the 1970s, called the Squadron Supreme, who essentially started as a dig at DC because it's very clearly sort of a takeoff of the Justice League. You've got Nighthawk instead of Batman, the Wizard instead of the Flash, Hyperion instead of Superman, Dr. Spectrum instead of the Green Lantern, and Power Princess instead of Wonder Woman, all with the same powers. And in the 1980s, there was a very good, very important miniseries written by Mark Gruenwald about this group. But, you know, that's something that just occasionally got touched on, not the way that there was this Earth 1 and Earth 2 at DC. But in the year 2000, Marvel went full in on an alternate reality, parallel Earth set of superheroes that were kind of mirrors of the regular Marvel superheroes, kind of the way that DC had been doing for so long. So they started this whole new line called the Ultimates, the Ultimate line. And there were alternate reality versions of the Avengers, of SpiderMan, the X-Men, and the Fantastic Four. And in this alternate reality, you had many of the same characters, but their personalities were different, in some cases subtly different, in some cases dramatically different. Kind of like the Heroes Reborn, but a lot more well done. A lot more well done. And the idea was to have this alternate reality imprint, essentially, that new readers could pick up and immediately be able to learn the backstory without having 30 years of back issues and back stories to wade through. So this would not be affected by anything that had happened in the regular Marvel Universe. Now notice the timing on this. It's the year 2000. That was right around the time that the X-Men movie, the first X-Men movie, was being a hit in cinemas. And so part of the reason for this was, well, you know, if casual fans see things like that X-Men movie, the SpiderMan movie that was about to come out, and want to pick up the comics, we don't want them to get so confused that they quit because there's so much to learn. So just start fresh. Now, some of the differences in the Ultimate Universe, in addition to the fact that in some cases, especially with the Ultimates and with the Ultimate Captain America, there was a harder, grittier edge. Other elements included the fact that in this universe, Nick Fury was a black guy, not a middle-aged white Irish American guy from Hell's Kitchen. And he was a black guy that looked just like Samuel L. Jackson. Another change, they started off with Peter Parker as Spider-Man, and somewhere around issue 11 or 12, I think, he got killed off. Peter Parker died, and it was replaced by a new Spider-Man, Miles Morales, who was an Afro-Latino teenager. which was a very bold choice, but one they could make because this is not going to affect the regular timeline. And that really demonstrates how closely aligned not just the Ultimates universe, but Marvel Comics in general, are going to be with the Marvel movies once the Marvel movies start becoming successful. Now, there had been attempts to make Marvel movies in the past, mostly TV shows in the 70s, a couple of really bad movies in the early 90s, really low budget, campy movies, one about the Punisher and one Captain America, and then a Fantastic Four movie in the early 90s that was so bad it never got released. But beginning with Blade in the late 90s, followed quickly by X-Men and then SpiderMan, the Marvel films become more successful, and this sort of this synergy between the comics and the films starts to become evident in the comics because, well, for instance, after the first X-Men movie comes out, in the comics, the team starts wearing black leather outfits instead of the colorful costumes they'd always worn. And then sometimes it goes the other way, that a black Nick Fury Jr. is introduced in the comics after the success of the movie version, starring Samuel L. Jackson as Nick Fury. That was in turn based on the Ultimates. In fact, the Marvel films really are more closely aligned with the Ultimates universe than with the traditional Marvel timeline. So all just kind of going back and forth. Well, we'll talk more about movies in a bit, but first let's do the same thing. Let's do the same thing with Marvel that we did with DC, and see how they're trying to redefine themselves and stake their identity in the 21st century. All right, well, this is some complicated stuff also, and I'm just going to kind of go over it just sort of briefly to give you an overview and a timeline. In 2004, and bear in mind this is the same time as that identity crisis thing with the rape and the mind wipe and all that stuff is going on over at DC, the the crossover event Avengers Disassembled is presented, in which things start to come unraveled there in Avengers Mansion, particularly where the Scarlet Witch is concerned. The Scarlet Witch is an extraordinarily powerful mutant who can affect reality itself, and she's had some issues in the past, and she's in a romantic relationship with Hawkeye, who is cheating on her with the Wasp, and one thing leads to another, and Wanda has a bit of a meltdown, and it translates into all these terrible things happening, like the She-Hulk becoming extraordinarily barbaric and aggressive, kind of like the Angry Hulk, and then literally ripping Ant-Man in half. Jack of Hearts, I think, got blown up at one point. Hawkeye got killed, and the Avengers broke up, basically. So it was a rough few months for those issues. That was 2004. 2005, a new version of the Avengers came out. So the Avengers was canceled, and now you've got the new Avengers #1, in which you have a new lineup. This is written by Brian Michael Bendis, and he was told he had to use certain characters. Particularly, he had to have Wolverine and Spider-Man, because they are at new heights of popularity due to the movies. And so, the people upstairs wanted them in the Avengers. But he was told that he could augment the team with whoever he wanted, and he wanted Luke Cage to be an Avenger. So Luke Cage is one of the new Avengers. Captain America is leading the thing, and yes, Wolverine becomes a member of the Avengers. moonlighting from his job as a member of the X-Men. And you've got, Iron Man, Spider-Man, etc. A character named Ronan that is very mysterious, that no one knows exactly who they are, as well as Spider-Woman. All right, well, same year, you have another miniseries, an X-Men based crossover, House of M, in which the Scarlet Witch, still in her break from reality, reorders reality to fit her frame of mind, which is not very good at the time. And essentially, in her recreated reality, her dead Magneto is now in charge of the world. And the superheroes are prevented from doing anything to stop that, because the reality-bending powers of the Scarlet Witch have given every one of them everything that they want. And so it's kind of a difficult proposition getting them to rise up in rebellion. But ultimately, it does happen. Now, during this, everybody's getting everything they want. Scarlet Witch wanted Hawkeye back alive, so poof, he's back alive. 2006 saw Marvel's Civil War, in which the U.S. government, kind of like 20 years earlier in the pages of The Dark Knight Returns and in Watchmen at DC, the U.S. government decides that superpowered people have to be registered and controlled by the government. And Tony Stark, alias Iron Man, is in favor of this action for the greater good. Steve Rogers, alias Captain America, is vigorously opposed to it because he believes that it is an infringement on basic freedoms of the superheroes in question. And so he refuses to submit. And then a bunch of superheroes come over to be on his side. A bunch of others come over to be on Iron Man's side. And they fight it out for months, crossing over into all the Marvel comics. And it was really a very dramatic story. Ultimately, the Iron Man side wins. And Captain America surrenders to the proper authorities. And when he does, he is assassinated. Whereupon, James Buchanan Barnes, once known as Bucky, also once known as Dead Bucky, turns out was not dead, right? He was a Russian spy that was brainwashed into being a Russian spy, named assassin rather, called the Winter Soldier. Well, he's cured of that, and so he takes over as Captain America. So you used to have Captain America and Bucky. Now you've got Captain America / Bucky. And that's him there on the right with a much more militarized uniform. Also, he did tend to shoot people sometimes. One of the other things that was a fallout or a repercussion of Civil War was the Amazing Spider-Man storyline, One More Day. Now, during the Civil War thing, Spider-Man had been on Iron Man's side, but then he had switched sides. And at one point, his Aunt May gets shot and is dying. He doesn't want Aunt May to die. And he is approached by Mephisto. That's the guy that looks kind of like the devil on account of he's the devil, as in Mephistopheles, who is actually a Marvel character since the 1960s, old archenemy of the Silver Surfer. And he offers Peter Parker a deal. Aunt May can stay alive if Peter Parker will sacrifice the other thing that means the most to him, which is his marriage. So, in order to keep Aunt May alive, Peter Parker agrees to this deal with Satan, and reality is changed. It is retconned, and now he and Mary Jane never got married. And it's not like, they got married and it changed. It never happened, and no one has any memory of it happening, which is a big step in DC continuity direction, and was the decision of Marvel's editor-in-chief, Joe Quesada, who was one of those people that believed that marrying off Peter Parker had been a huge mistake because that limits the options with the character, and so this was the only way to get out of that without Peter Parker winding up being a divorced guy or a widower. And so that's what happened. A deal with Satan. I'm trying not to sound like a grumpy old man here. There were plenty of people who by 2006 had grown up with Peter Parker and Mary Jane as a married couple because they had been so since 1986 in the comics, so 20 years. But that was all undone. This is one of the reasons that I have negative feelings toward the editorial and creative decisions of Joe Quesada. All right, well, anyway, another repercussion of Civil War is that this storyline called the Initiative comes out afterwards. So now, if you have superpowers, you have to register with the government and basically do what they say. And if you are discovered to have superpowers, you're put in a training program. What winds up happening is the Avengers divide in two, and there are two different teams of Avengers now. The Mighty Avengers, who are the official Avengers, led by Iron Man, and the New Avengers, who are basically the Avengers who were Team Captain America. And this includes Luke Cage and Iron Fist, Doctor Strange, Wolverine, SpiderMan, who now is in this darker mood, so he goes back to his black suit. So the New Avengers are fighting bad guys, but at the same time are wanted by the authorities, and the Mighty Avengers are chasing them around and stuff. Well, then 2008, the big storyline that lasted basically all year, also anchored in the Avengers, was Secret Invasion, in which it was discovered that the Skrulls, the alien shapeshifters, had infiltrated Earth and had assumed the identities of various different people, including several superheroes. So, who can you trust? Eventually, the Skrulls are defeated. Unfortunately, as the Skrulls are defeated, it leaves Iron Man not looking so good for having, this happening on his watch. He also gets injured. His armor, or a version of his armor, has been adopted by Norman Osborn, alias the Green Goblin, Spider-Man's archenemy, who's now calling himself Iron Patriot in a red, white, and blue outfit. So he kind of swoops in and makes it look like he's the one that beat the Skrulls, and so everyone loves him, and he's put in charge of the official government group of the Avengers in a storyline called Dark Reign, because, he's actually a supervillain, and so the New Avengers are mostly his supervillain pals, people like, for example, Venom. Well, that's 2009. 2010, two storylines. The first one, Siege, which covered the first half of the year, in which Thor's evil brother Loki basically tricks Norman Osborn into taking his Dark Avengers and trying to go occupy Asgard, invade Asgard. Turns out that's a bad idea. And by the time all is said and done, Osborn is revealed as the villain that he is, and the original Captain America, by the way, is back alive again by means that are too complicated and strange to even try to explain. And this leads into the second storyline, the Heroic Age, in which all the heroes are heroes again, and all the heroes like each other again, just like it always used to be before Avengers Disassembled. Well, there were several other storylines, basically one each year. There was one called Fear Itself, in which the villains from Asgard tried to invade Earth. Then, in 2015, there was a big one called Secret Wars, which kind of, is an homage to the 1984 miniseries. But in this one, Earth 616, which is the one where the Marvel superheroes live, and the ultimate superheroes, Earth, get mushed together, kind of like Earth 1 and Earth 2. And when all is said and done, then the Ultimates universe is destroyed and has phased into the regular Marvel universe, which is now called Marvel Prime. This is remarkably like, and by remarkably I mean exactly, the resolution of Crisis on Infinite Earths 20 years before that at DC. So no more Ultimates, but some of those Ultimate characters, like Miles Morales, now exist on Earth Prime and always have, so far as anyone, including them, is aware. So Miles Morales, who was an Ultimates Earth character, is now a regular Marvel character. And so there are two Spider-Men, one of them, Peter Parker, being sort of a mentor to the younger one. Well, that's all kind of weird. It was meant to be permanent, but within a year or two, there were hints that actually the Ultimates universe still existed. That may sound kind of weird, but it's not as weird as what happened in 2017 with a storyline called Secret Empire, in which it turns out Captain America is actually a spy for Hydra, which is the arch enemy organization of S.H.I.E.L.D., and has been for years and years and years. And so he takes over America. And the other superheroes band together to try to stop him. Ultimately, it is discovered that this is sort of an alternate reality version of Captain America. And, the quote-unquote real Steve Rogers is eventually reinstalled, and this guy goes down in ignominious defeat. But for a long time, Marvel was insisting, oh no, this is not a quote fake story. This is really happening. Captain America is a spy. Well, year after that, there was a storyline called Fresh Start. That's kind of like the heroic age. All the good guys are good guys again, and things are kind of reset back to the way they had been. And that was followed by another Asgard-centric crossover, War of the Realms, which was pretty interesting, kind of like high fantasy. But that's kind of a quick rundown of the various different storylines at Marvel. Now, you stop and do the math. What all this means is that Marvel Comics has been in one continuous multi-cross-company crossover event from 2004 right up to now. It started in 2004. It never ended. It's all one big major crossover event that you have to follow every single issue of every single title to get the whole story. And it also demonstrates how, as I've hinted at before, Marvel, which for years had prided themselves on being more realistic in their approach than DC, and not messing around with all these multiverses and alternate realities, have started doing just that. And they've also started rebooting their universe, just like DC. It seems like every 2 or 3 years, reboot the whole thing, shift it all around, and start all the comics over again at number 1. So you've got a number 1 issue collector's edition every year or so for every title.